Hi, everyone. I'm Rajesh Kalyanam. I'm a research scientist at Purdue University. I'll be talking about GeoEDF, a framework for geospatial research workflows. This is still very much work in progress, and I really want to thank the Pegasus team, especially Karan, Mats, and Ryan for all their help in pushing on this project and helping me implement the various pieces on here. So yeah, big thanks to all of you guys with this. I do have a pretty long preamble, but I promise there is a Pegasus slide in there. So, so please wait for that. So stay tuned, I guess. So GeoEDF, here's the sort of broad vision of what really brought about this project. So we've been building science gateways and different applications for geospatial research for the past 10 to 15 years. And something we've noticed is that despite all of these different tools and platforms that we build, researchers still spend a lot of time just wrangling data. So especially in the geospatial sciences, you might have to bring in data from, say, NASA, USGS, other large repositories, because you don't really have the resources to collect all of that data, but it's really important for your simulations and your research workflows. And so, so really data wrangling is a pretty significant component of all these workflows in the geosciences. And the issue with that is that researchers often have a pretty ad hoc workflow. So they might say bring in data from a repository, work on a desktop tool like say QGIS or ArcGIS, which are the really popular desktop tools. They might do some pre-processing on there. Then move the data over maybe to a cluster to do some HPC simulations. And then finally, when they get to the task of publishing it, then they might use a science gateway just to curate or publish that data. And so you can imagine all of the different issues involved with that, especially in the realm of reproducibility and just being able to share your work with other researchers. That presents significant challenges because no one is really able to reproduce what you've done. And usually you see that it's students who are working on these projects, and they might build some ad hoc code just to get through maybe their thesis or that particular research project. And so if the student leaves, then we have this really nice post-it note here that one of my colleagues made, which essentially depicts the knowledge transfer, saying these files are in here, the code is in here, it's your job now to build it and get it running again. So the ideal situation is something that we have here on the right. So ideally, you would be able to come to a science gateway or a cyber infrastructure platform, define your high-level workflow that you would want to do, have the platform actually run it and do everything for you. And then along the way, maybe collect some metadata and annotations so that you can publish your workflow along with the data, and then have that all in one place. I'm just gonna so our goal really is to make this thing in the center, which is GeoEDF, which essentially helps you go from this current scenario here on the left to this ideal situation on the right, where everything is self-contained in a science gateway. You can define an abstract workflow, run it, and then have metadata collected automatically so that you can then enable both research reproducibility, but then also make progress towards fair science. So GeoEDF is funded by the NSF. It's a 5-year CSSI project, and it's still work in progress, as I mentioned. And the goal essentially is to provide a framework that sort of enables fair science in geospatial research. It's led by a really multidisciplinary team. Carol Song, my boss, is the PI of this project. And we have use cases from several different geospatial domains that you see here on the screen. We have things from agriculture, civil engineering, flood modeling, hydrology, and also sustainable development and ag econ as well. So here's an example of one such workflow from agricultural economics, essentially just to drive home the point. You have a really nice workflow diagram here that talks about the different data sets that are involved, the processes that you might have to use to essentially get to your final stage. And as you can see here in this particular domain, you have data from like the UN, which is crop data. You might have economic data from the World Bank and all these different sources. And then your task really is to combine them, or your research task is to combine them and get to your final research outputs. But then once you go to a whiteboard and start to draw up this workflow, then there's a lot of hidden details. So for example, you realize that some of these data sets may be zip files that need to be unzipped, and you need to extract a certain file inside in there. They might be in a specific format, and you might have to do some sort of filtering to extract the data that you're interested in for your specific spatial region. They might only have data for a certain year, and you might have to filter that as well. And then there's a lot of assumed sort of data transformation. So some of the more bespoke models, so to say, may work on a specific custom format, like the HAR format that's in here, which is essentially a tabular format. But then the input data is all in CSVs, and so there's these intermediate connection steps. So what does GeoEDF sort of help you do? So so the real goal or the design behind GeoEDF is to organize all the work across these three different principles. So the first thing is, when you start with the geospatial research workflow, first we want to break down the constituent tasks into essentially data acquisition and processing. That's a very high level view of it, but that seems like that's a pretty good level to stick to, at least initially. So break down your research workflow into a collection of data acquisition and then data processing subtasks. Once we've identified those, then make those reusable building blocks so that people don't really have to reinvent them from scratch or write their own code for that. We give them the building blocks, and then they build their workflows out of pieces that help them essentially implement these tasks. And then finally, once we have control over these building blocks, then we can start to inject and add hooks that essentially help track metadata, add annotations through along the way, so that we can essentially maybe push towards more fair science principles at the end. So mapping that onto real tangible things, the data acquisition is implemented by what we call data connectors. The data processing is implemented by data processors. And then we have a workflow composer that essentially allows you to take connectors and processors together, plug them together, create workflows, and then execute them on different resources. So I won't go through these slides here, but essentially these are examples of connectors that you can build. As you can see, there's a whole lot of different data sources from various organizations like NASA, USDA, other projects like Quasi, which is a really large hydrology consortium, and other places as well. There are some which we don't really have APIs for, like for example, Google Earth Engine makes you work in their platform, but those are some examples that you can think of. And processing, again, these can be both domain independent or agnostic, but also domain dependent. So you might have really simple geospatial operations, but then it can be as complex as running a whole hydrology model, for example. So what is the workflow composer itself do? So it has two different pieces. There's the framework that actually allows us to define, or where we define the standardized interfaces for these connectors and processors so that you can really connect them together without having to figure out what the actual business logic is behind the scenes. So they're essentially just black boxes with the standard interface. And then it also provides the semantics for how you compose them together and how workflow dependencies and those kinds of things are established between these different pieces. The engine, and that's where Pegasus comes into play, is actually allowing us to then take these abstract workflows, which are essentially sequences of connectors and processors, and then transform them into actual code that's running on the actual compute resources. So really, in a nutshell, we have connectors and processors, which are Python classes. We have instances of these, which you can specify in YAML when you're actually trying to build a workflow. And then finally, workflows are just sequences of these connector and processor instances. Here's an example from hydrology that sort of illustrates how this transformation happens from your research task to GeoEDF. So for example, here, there's a NASA repository that's serving MODIS sensor data that's been collected by these satellites. Maybe you want to work on a certain watershed, and then you want to know the leaf area in that particular region if you want to do like a flood model or something like that. So you have data from NASA, you have your own watershed map. There are some masking and aggregation operations which give you a weighted map, and then finally you can feed it in to your hydrologic model. How does that translate in the GeoEDF realm? Well, here you have a connector that's helping you get the data from NASA. You have a processor that's implementing this masking operation. It knows nothing about the specific domain. It just knows that if I have an HDF file and a shape file, which is a vector file with this watershed map, then I know how to mask it and get weighted values. And then finally, it outputs a certain shapefile at the end as well. So here is the actual YAML workflow for that specific example. As you can see, it's a pretty simple variable binding sort of representation. There are Python classes, which are our connectors and processors. So you can see NASA input is a Python connector class. The HDF shapefile US mask is a processor class. And then the bindings for these classes, for the class variables, essentially are mentioned here. So for example, if I wanted to, this particular connector is getting data from NASA. So one of the inputs needs to be the URL where that data is located, and obviously your username and password, and you would leave the password blank because it's going to prompt you when it's actually running. There is a sort of interesting piece in here, which is what we call filters. You don't really want to make these connectors too specific for a particular use case. So for example, here, the way NASA usually stores its files, or at least some of these repositories, it actually has a lot of details encoded in the URL itself, the endpoint to that file. So if you're looking for data for a particular region or for a particular year, then the file name essentially has that encoded in it. So rather than hardcode that in, say you wanted to rerun the simulation for different years, then we want to have that flexibility in the workflow file itself. And so in this case, the filter actually allows you to say, for example, the loop over value. So if you wanted to get all the data for a certain time period, then the filter would help you generate those strings of date time values and then feed them in, instantiate this particular string here, and then that goes back and then provides an input to your connector. And then you can essentially run the simulation for different periods without having to go and change the file by hand and do it again. So here's the Pegasus slide. So how does Pegasus come into play here? So Pegasus really, as I mentioned before, is part of our engine, which allows us to take these abstract workflows and then concretize them and actually run them on the different compute resources. So each connector and processor building block essentially is converted into its own sub-workflow, and we essentially use hierarchical workflows here. So we have a sub-workflow that's created for each of these connectors and processors, and then a top-level DAX that's essentially running one sub-workflow after the other. And the reason we use these sub-workflows is because, as you might have imagined, there's a lot of dynamic stuff that's going on in here. So you don't know beforehand what the number of bindings would be for some of these variables. And depending on the number of files your connector has produced, your processor would need to run essentially in parallel for efficiency's sake on all of those files. And so, so each of these essentially at runtime creates a dynamic workflow based on the inputs that have been created in the previous stage. And when the workflow is running, we don't really bring back the intermediate data products. So the only thing that's being sent back to the submit node is essentially maybe the bindings that have been created for filters or the list of files that have been produced by the connector or retrieved by the connector, so that you can then use those in constructing your second or your next stage sub-workflow. And at the end, obviously, when everything is done, the outputs are returned then back to your submit node. And then since these connectors and processors can have arbitrary dependencies, we use containers, specifically Singularity. And we, as you might have seen before, we had things like passwords in there that you're prompting the user for. And so we generate a key pair for each workflow, just so you can encrypt any things that have been left blank and need to be transferred over to your execution nodes. So this is still a community-driven project. So we are not really proposing to build all these connectors and processors ourselves. So we have essentially a CICD pipeline and a contribution process set up for that. So users essentially go into GitHub, and then they can follow our prior examples, create their own connectors and processors. We have a GitHub action that builds a Singularity container out of the connector and processor code, and then pushes it to our own Singularity registry. And then the GeoEDF framework essentially queries this registry so that it can figure out the URIs to use when it's building the transformation catalog for the workflows. I won't go into this, but this is essentially still work in progress for our whole CI integration system. Our hope is to have this framework deployed on a science gateway so that users of the gateway can essentially come in, use GeoEDF just like they would any other Python library, create workflows, and then execute them without having to know what's really behind the scenes. So here's the roadmap where we hope to have all of that done. so far have several connectors and processes in place, the CICD pipeline. I also built a proof of concept Jupyter notebook that was based on Ryan's development container, where you can actually just use the local Condor pool to run GeoEDF workflows on there. We are working with Mats and Karan right now to help set up the connections to our clusters. And then this will all be integrated into our Science Gateway that we've had running for several years now. And then in the future, we are hoping to have more releases available on GitHub and all the different locations. I'll move on to the feedback at the end. So these might all just be variations on a theme, I guess. But I think in our specific case, just the integration with our Science Gateway and cyber infrastructure, it raises some challenges. I don't think they are unsurmountable challenges or anything. There's just things we need to think about when you want to support, say, multiple users who may come in with their own allocations. You can obviously do some of these things by hand, but then how would you sort of set everything up so that that can be more seamless when you're actually integrating this with an existing Science Gateway. The one idea I've thought of is maybe have a middleware layer that acts as your submit node as well, and then all the sort of sensitive information is on there, and the users are really just interacting with that through a thin API interface. But it would still be great to have best practices for how we would do that, and if they don't exist, it'd be great if, I guess, if we come up with something, and we'd really like to contribute that back, I guess, to the community. And as far as new features go, I think these are things which I think I've seen in the past in other talks as well. So there's things like support for conditionals, maybe human in the loop. And this is something that's come up for us with people from archaeology who are processing satellite images from archaeological sites, and they usually want to have someone taking a close look at the result to see if things like mosaicing and those processes have worked properly. And so it might be great if we can sort of add that in. And I know with DAGs and DAXs, that's probably not really too obvious, but yeah, that's something that would be great to have. And of course, just being able to monitor, again, from a Science Gateway perspective, being able to know what task and what sub workflow is currently executing so that users know what stage their workflow is in. That would be great. And I think the REST API that's in there, that's out there, might maybe be a good step towards that. So with that, I want to thank everyone. And again, thanks to the Pegasus team. And I've got links here to our repo and the gateway and emails where you can talk to us. Thanks.